This is the Hot Topics panel. We're going to be talking about M&A, venture financing, IP, and products liability. So just about everything you need to know what's going on in MedTech in 45 minutes. So that's our task today. So wish us luck. My name is Dave Dykman. I'm a patent attorney and shareholder at Greenberg Traurig. I'm here in Boston. Our office is just a few blocks up the street. We're thrilled to see everybody here. There's plenty of seats up front. It's just like school. Nobody's coming to sit in the front row. And there's a number of articles on the table. You should feel free to take them on different topics that the lawyers at Greenberg have written about. So we've got a great panel today. So we're going to get into it. But before we do that, we're going to see if the slides work. There we go. So Greenberg Traurig, if you don't know, we're an international law firm, about 2,000 lawyers around the world. We have the most offices of any law firm in the US. We're very strong in Europe and Asia, South America, wherever the action is, we're there. And we have a full service law firm. On our panel today, you've got myself from the IP department. Next to me is Evan Holden, who does products liability law. So if you're in big trouble, you have to talk to Evan. And then we've got Trevor Traplick, who does a lot of the corporate side, M&A, financing, to help get you the money to grow your companies. So we're happy to help you. We work with a lot of MedTech companies really across the spectrum. And when we got the panel together, we got some of our friends who are in industry, Omar Morano, who's a MD, venture capitalist, private equity, and now running a company in the cardiac ablation space. And then we've got Alex DeWinter, who does early stage investing for GE Ventures. So we've got a lot of smart people, so my job's to get out of the way. But before we get into it, we thought we'd take a survey and see who's in the audience. So how many people are on the engineering side? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people more are on the sales marketing side? Any regulatory people in the audience? Okay. And there must be some lawyers here too, so nice to see you guys, you know. That's who we can make fun of later, so. Any investors in the audience? So everybody's going to go talk to him right afterwards then, so now we know. And who's in more on the medical device side? We have some robotics people in the house? No? And what about more on medical technology side, connected medical devices, wearables? Perfect. Well, thanks for that. And when we talked the panel doing our pre-calls, we've tried to figure out what are the best topics to touch on with you guys. And we're going to be touching on what are the M&A trends. The IPO market is still pretty tight for medical devices and medical technology, much tighter than our biotech friends on the other side of the river in Cambridge. So M&A is still probably the most likely and some of the best exits for medical technology companies. And we're going to look at how IP protection plays into getting deals done. Both financing and M&A. And then at the end, we're going to hear from Evan on kind of a products liability, what you need to know and what you need to avoid to stay out of the products liability litigation web that seems to be growing and growing every year. So with that, I'm going to have each panelist introduce themselves, tell us what they're doing, and then talk about a trend that they've been seeing in the market over the last year to 18 months. The first person is all the way down on my left. We're going to start with Alex DeWinter. He's a managing director at GE Ventures, where he does a lot of their early stage investing on a lot of life science tools, precision medicine, really exciting cutting edge technology. So Alex, why don't you tell us what you're seeing there and some trends?
Thanks, Dave. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Alex DeWinter. I've been with GE Ventures now for 6 years. Our office is also right down the street. I look at, as Dave mentioned, precision medicine, so a lot of clinical diagnostics. We invest in Series A and later stage. GE Ventures invest in pretty much everything besides invasive medical devices and pharmaceuticals, so we're trying to avoid the product liability issues. But really, across healthcare, we look quite broadly. elsewhere. So in general, the things that I'm seeing right now, there's been a surprising increase in investment in diagnostics that we've noticed over the last couple of years. So that was an area that historically has been out of favor because there wasn't a lot of money coming out of diagnostics. It was historically an area a lot of money went in, but unfortunately there wasn't a lot of M&A or IPO activity. But over the last couple of years, we've seen a couple of companies really do quite well. So Guardant Health, which was only just started about 6 years ago, is now a $6 billion public company. It's a liquid biopsy company. Grail has raised over $1 billion also in liquid biopsy. And CareDx, which was historically, it's like a 15-year-old company that's really been shunned. It was originally in the heart transplant diagnostic space, has now pivoted into kidney transplant diagnostics, and is now over $1 billion also. So there's been a lot of interest, sort of renewed interest, I'd say, in diagnostics with some of these exits. So that's an area I'm going to continue monitoring.
Thank you. I'm Trevor Chaplick. I'm a corporate partner with GT. I've been basically a deal attorney for about 30 years on both coasts. Spent my first 10 years in Silicon Valley, and then came to the East Coast and been here about 20 years. General transactional experience, very similar to the data point slides we're going to show you. I do both financing, M&A, and capital markets transactions. In terms of trends, I'm going to actually hit on two, I think, very pronounced trends. One is rep and warranty insurance, which has been around, but is really becoming a lot more common in deals, and we're going to drill down briefly on that. And then the one I really want to hit is CFIUS. That, as a result of a change in the law last November, has, I think, radically impacted the deal market, and not just M&A. It's affecting financings as well as spin-outs and even joint ventures and licenses. So I want to hit on that because I think it's going to affect you across a broad stratum of transactions.
Hi, Omar Amarana. I recently left Allied Minds, which was a publicly listed venture firm listed on the London Stock Exchange. I've been in venture. I was in Oxford Bioscience Partners before that, so I've been in venture since 2005. Like Trevor, I spent over a decade in Silicon Valley and as part of 4 startups, so I have a blend of operating experience and venture investing experience. Having gone back into an operating role and now out raising money, I've heard one specific resounding theme from the VCs that I've spoken to, and while the number of VCs investing in Medtech has decreased over recent years, I'm hearing a resounding theme that Medtech is having a resurgence, and that as seen or as witnessed by a number of high quality exits, even IPOs. It's remarkable to see the IPO window open again for Medtech. And the admission that founders and investors need to prepare to take their companies into the revenue stage arena. You're seeing companies not only get stronger, but you're seeing companies build for the future and take a long-term approach. And I think that's a really good thing for our industry.
And hi, I'm Evan Holden. I'm with Greenberg Trorg's Atlanta office, and I do product liability litigation. Most of my work is for either drug or device companies, and mostly in the bad situations that Dave mentioned. But we also do a lot of counseling to companies to try to help them minimize their risk and avoid getting into litigation. And I'm in Atlanta now, but I'm from Boston originally, so I am a Patriots and a Bruins fan, of course, and it's always nice to come back here.
And the only way I could get Evan here is when I asked him a couple months ago, he said, I'll come if the Bruins make the Stanley Cup Finals. So he gets credit for the great run we're seeing right now.
And just a couple of trends that we're seeing in products litigation. I mean, you've probably sort of seen some of the news. There's an ever-increasing number of cases that are being filed in consolidated actions called multi-district litigation or consolidated state court litigation, which basically are a vehicle for plaintiffs' firms to file cases with much greater ease. And so you're now seeing them file tens of thousands of cases in, for instance, the hernia mesh MDL. It's a very easy and cheap way for plaintiffs' attorneys to put a lot of leverage on device companies, which then in turn makes it harder for companies to avoid having to pay a big settlement. The other trend we're seeing is that as plaintiffs' attorneys kind of have more resources and are better organized, are a little savvier, they are really hitting the jackpot with some huge verdicts, and you're seeing really high 8-figure verdicts in single plaintiff cases somewhat routinely now, and even some 9-figure verdicts and billion-dollar verdicts. So the number of claims is rising, but the stakes are rising for companies. Sorry to be a killjoy, but.
That's why we saved his talk for the end. So, no, but it's good stuff you need to know, and you need to figure out to be proactive and get these audits done before you have a problem. So we're going to jump right into it. Our first top topic is really what's going on with the dollars, M&A and financing. And really, there's a lot of interesting things. And we're going to see some slides, get some broad data, and we're going to look at some trends and then hear a little bit of the nuances on CFIUS and rep and warranty insurance that Trevor mentioned. So the first thing we thought we'd do is just look at kind of the big picture. What have been the M&A headlines for 2018 and 2019? And really, if you look at what it's been probably since 2014, 15, 16, 17, is there's been a lot of big headlining medtech deals, the billion-dollar deals. A lot of consolidation at the top in the medical device and medtech industry has been the theme really since Medtronic bought Covidien. Since then, that was kind of the first mega merger, and since then we're still seeing it, and it continued this year. We saw Boston Scientific in 2018 was incredibly active, 9 different acquisitions. We put up some of the biggest ones with the highest dollar value, but BTG in oncology, $4.2 billion. Another Augmetics, another cancer treatment, and then the urology unit as well. That was just a sampling of their 9 acquisitions, and they continued in 2019. Stryker on the orthopedic side was also very active in 2018. 3 headline acquisitions. K2M was a $1 billion acquisition. And Intellis for ENT treatment, $660 million. And Hyperbranch, for dural seals, $220 million. And of the big boys, Medtronic wanted to make sure they were in the headlines too, so they acquired Maser Robotics, which I think is a trend overall you're seeing. The fact that the robotics show was combined with device talks this year, I think, is a greater industry trend. Certainly robotic surgery is getting hotter and hotter. So that was 2018, kind of the big picture from the big boys, the big companies. And then there were also some very significant deals from unusual sources too. We're seeing private equity getting more and more involved in medtech, trying to roll companies together. And then I think it's, what's next? We've got biopsy, synthetic cartilage implants, and healthcare. So the technologies that are getting acquired are all over the medtech space. So it's really an area of finding your right buyer, and I think with private equity moving in, the traditional buyers aren't the only options now. So that's 2018, and looking into 2019, the story is very similar. We've had, just in the first half of this year, the first 5 months, we've had a lot of billion-dollar acquisitions. You can see them there on the screen in orthopedic devices. 3M is getting into the advanced wound care with a $6 billion, almost a $7 billion acquisition of Acelity. And then J&J has been very active this year with some big deals. And Boston Scientific wasn't done with their 9 deals in 2018. They're also moving on this year with almost a $500 million deal. So I don't know, who wants to talk a little bit about what do all these M&A trends mean? Who wants to connect the dots?
I think there's one thing that's blatantly obvious, and that is that large medical device companies still rely on small, highly innovative, creative, lean entrepreneurs to fuel their pipelines. And that, to me, is a never-ending, resounding theme that, in my opinion, won't go away ever.
And Alex, as kind of an early stage investor, what do the M&A trends mean to you and your kind of investment thesis?
So as you pointed out, medical devices had historically been not really looked too kindly upon by investors. But I think now seeing some of these exits, there's bound to be increased interest in investing in this space. We had an exit in our own portfolio. Neuronetics went public earlier this year, or last year, I guess it was. So there's continued interest. I think there's going to be increased interest in investing in medical devices, although not for me, because that's not really what I do.
Dave, and just to underscore your point about private equity as opposed to venture moving into at least the biotech space, I was actually here at a closing dinner last night for a client like in bioscience that was party to a buyout transaction by Windrose Partners. But it really, at the end of the day, was really felt and is much like a venture deal. So I think that there's a lot to that in your observation.
Omar, I'm just curious, why is it that the big device companies rely on kind of the smaller incubators to fuel that R&D? Why can't they do it themselves?
It's a great question. Personally, I think they can do it. I think they simply aren't good at it. And why are they not good at it? They're burdened with a tremendous amount of process, a tremendous amount of delineation, a tremendous amount of infrastructure that requires consensus building. When you're a 5 to 10 or 15 or 50 person organization, the consensus building becomes a lot easier than when you're a 500 person business unit with a tremendous amount of concern over what projects get chopped, what projects don't get chopped. It's much easier to buy with corporate dollars than it is to build with internal expense dollars that hit your EPS. So there's a financial motivation for one, and two, there's a job retention motivation, and that is I want to protect my own program and therefore keep my job. And lastly, and probably most importantly, that I think you folks could comment on, and that is, the liability associated with taking risk is a daunting topic for large organizations. Small companies really have nothing to lose, so they're willing to take risk as long as they can quantify it and understand it and reduce it. And that's basically what we do. We take calculated risk, knowing that there is an element of huge reward if it works, and there's also a downside. The downside is that it could potentially not work, or God forbid, it could actually hurt a patient. So I think there's some really key factors that lend themselves to saying that, large corporations simply don't want to take the same level of risk that small organizations would.
Yeah, speaking as a representative of a large corporation, I would wholeheartedly second that aversion to risk. I mean, GE is not unlike all the other corporations, extremely, extremely averse to taking risk. But one of the ways we found of innovating, or at least commercializing some of our innovations internally, is rather than commercializing them internally, we've recently started spinning them out. So we have within GE Ventures a new business creation group that looks to stand up new companies based around a technology that GE has, but has been sort of left on the shelf because, again, sometimes people just aren't comfortable sort of putting themselves out there. So by putting them outside the company, we've been able to start up new companies with these new technologies, which sort of allows this greater risk taking. But it's interesting to see the ways, sort of the machinations that corporations go through to actually maintain innovation from their technologies.
Just a quick note, plaintiffs' firms, when they're looking at kind of what's going to be the next big target, they'll take into account how much money does the company have? And if it is a smaller startup company who's not going to be able to pay out $1 billion in settlements, they might go find another company to sue, another device. No good deed goes unpunished, I guess.
Can I just echo on a point you just made on the spinouts? One of my clients is Mount Sinai, which is the largest hospital research system in New York, and I specifically do a lot of their spinouts, and I've seen increased activity with increased partnering by big pharma and large strategic companies that would rather invest in technology that's been incubated, if you will, for years by a large research institution. So I think that's another data point to what you're mentioning.
And maybe Trevor, what do you think, the early 2019 M&A numbers, are at least robust in terms of pure deal size. What do you see for the rest of the year, and how does that play into financing, you think?
Well, that's a good segue into the charts. we've done this, I think this is our 4th year now, and what we've done is we've collaborated with PitchBook and prepared a 10-year kind of rolling average of venture activity, both in biotech and med devices, M&A activity, the same two, and IPO activity. And in past years, we've kind of slow walked through each of these slides, and rather than do that, I think what I'd like to do this year is just step back and talk about some macro issues that are affecting the market. I mean, if you look at those slides, it's a little perilous to do what we do. We only have first quarter hard data. So what we've done is done kind of simple extrapolation, assuming the first, final 3 quarters would be representative of the first quarter. But if you look at least the extrapolation, which is the far bar chart, on almost all of the charts, everything's up, which is no surprise. We've been in a strong market, upswing on investing, M&A activity, and IPO activity. So it's been looking like a good year. What I'd like to do, though, is what I think, I've done this now for 30 years. I've been through a lot of business cycles. I'm seeing a lot of strong signals that are indicating or suggesting that we may be going into a recession, if not a downturn. And I say that with the caveat that nobody really can predict anything. I mean, if we, for example, cut a trade deal with China, I think all bets are off. I think we may continue full steam. But let me tell you that the market signals I'm seeing that worry me that this may be the party's over. One, obviously, a lot of market volatility, stock market volatility, with the kind of melodrama of the trade negotiations. 2, the yield curve has inverted in May, and that's basically the 10-year Treasury rate has been less than the 3-month Treasury rate, and that's not a perfect predictor of recessions, but it's been a strong predictor. Yesterday was a little different. We got a big bounce from the the Fed announcement, so the yields went back up, but it was a yield worsening in May, so that's something to really keep your eye on. Oil prices have cratered. They're in almost bear market territory, and at the same time, gold has been rising. Those 2 metrics are often signals of, potential downturn. Inflation has been weakening, and that's why I think you saw the Fed yesterday announce that they may jump in, and that was a complete dramatic reversal of the Fed chairman's position. And then finally, there's been a global slowdown generally in economies. And you actually have negative yields in both Germany and Japan. And those are also signs that things may slow down. So I bring all this up by way of saying these trends all look great, but there's some real economic signals that may indicate that we may be in for an adjustment, or at least a minimum greater volatility. So let me step back and let our other commentators weigh in.
So Omar, you're trying to raise money in this climate, so you better, sounds like you better close by next week, huh?
I'm going to have a one-on-one with him in a little while. Totally agree and hate the volatility, hate the concept of a yield curve inversion. If nothing else, it just makes everybody chew their nails and wonder what's coming next. And if there's one thing the market hates, it's uncertainty. That uncertainty is going to clarify itself, and it's not going to stay the same for the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. So I view this as short-term blips along the path of something that we're seeing as a general multi-year-long trend in the device industry, and that is the device companies are growing. The device companies are sitting on records amounts of cash. They're highly profitable. Their gross margins have increased historically and will continue to increase as they have historically. And management's outlook is not only bullish, not bearish, it's bullish in the face of enormous reimbursement pressure coupled with political risk. So having said all that, I still see as my own outlook, the medtech sector is actually pretty recession-proof. The aging population globally is a force to be reckoned with. The U.S. is truly a component of a global market, and I think most companies that are fortified with cash today are looking to very large markets outside the U.S. And if you look at some of the more mature markets, the pacemaker market, the heart valve market, the defibrillator markets, et cetera, they've either found a way to reinvent themselves by going more percutaneous or quote unquote less invasive, or they've figured out paths to tap massive markets outside the U.S. So I still see, substantial growth and upside despite some of these global economic volatility type indicators that you point out, and therefore I'm still very bullish.
And what's the perspective from GE Ventures?
Well, I mean, GE itself is suffering through some macro issues of its own right now. And so, I mean, I think looking out globally across the sort of things that I generally spend most of my time doing, which is evaluating startups, we're sort of accustomed to seeing risk, and I don't think, I think the potential near-term downturn doesn't really affect our investing overall philosophy, because we're looking for typically investing now for an exit in 5 to 7 years, by which time hopefully the business cycles will have smoothed out. So, I mean, venture investing typically is, you look at such a large horizon that the macro trends tend not to overall impact you.
The irony is that in venture investing, you've already got committed capital for a decade in any new fund. So basically, if you're sitting on capital, your job is to deploy it. And you traditionally in the venture world see a delay or a lag of at least a year, if not longer sometimes, from when an economic recession occurs in the public markets as it translates into the private markets. But I mean, as was pointed out earlier, it's anybody's guess what can happen.
I guess I don't disagree with any of that, and the fundamentals of business are strong right now generally. That being said, having been through so many different economic cycles, when these signals happen, at least on the company side, if you're not a fund but you're a company, then you need to meet your obligations. Now would be a good time to raise capital and build cash given all these signals. Because when market windows shut and there's, you have a downturn, valuations decline, there's more risk aversion generally on the margin by fund investors, and exit scenarios duration can be pushed out. So, I think there was a real hard crash in 2000, and people learned their lesson from that. A lot of companies hit the wall, and they were a little smarter about it before the financial crisis and had boosted their balance sheets. But I mean, that would be my gratuitous advice to companies right now, is look at these signals and maybe be a little more conservative with your cash.
I think those are words to live by.
So, we've got the M&A exit slides up here over the last 10 years, and if you extrapolate it out, like Trevor said, it looks like, 2019 is on pace to be a good year. If you take out kind of the 2015 outlier for some of the mega mergers, it's a nice year. And the deals we're seeing, Trevor's on the front line of a lot of them, so maybe you can talk a little bit, Trevor, about rep and warranty insurance and transition that way.
Sure. This is rep and warranty insurance. What it is insurers will come in and they'll step in the place of a seller to provide a financial source for indemnity in the event there's a breach of a representation and warranty in the purchase agreement. And it's been around for a number of years, but it's really picked up in how common it is. I wouldn't say every deal, but about every other deal I'm seeing rep and warranty insurance is involved. You typically see it in deal sizes in the range of 25 to 750 million. That tends to be the sweet spot. I've got some data points here. I think this was from Aon. I'm still a little dubious about the first data point, but they report 45% of private company deals involve rep and warranty insurance. I don't doubt the second data point, which is about 3/4 of M&A deals involving PE or financial sponsors involve rep and warranty insurance. There's about increasing number of carriers that can get involved in this, and the pricing has been decreasing because of the competition. From a deal attorney perspective, I think it's really been a positive force because a couple things. One, it eliminates a lot of the trench warfare, if you will, between buyers and sellers negotiating the reps and warranties. In fact, when everyone steps back and thinks about it, they allow the buyers to actually get better reps because for the most part, the sellers are not going to be on the hook for a breach of the rep and warranty. Now, there's still a lot of due diligence that goes on by both buyers and the attorneys for the insurer, but it really speeds the process up. It gets quality reps, and it allows, I think, buyers to extract arguably a higher sales price. So it is really becoming an increasing phenomenon and a really good one, I think, for deals. Here, next slide, there's basically a self-insurance for the first 1%. You can think of it like a deductible. And then depending on how much coverage buyers want, it's typically, 10 to 15% of the deal price is covered by an insurance policy in plain English. There's a process you have to go through. There's a little more formality on the buyer's side and back-end diligence by the insurer. But boy, I'll tell you, it's really helped, I think, accelerate negotiation schedules and getting to signing and closing. Real positive development. I turn it over to my colleagues here to see if they've experienced that or have any other insights on it. Well, it's insurance, so it puts everyone to sleep.
I just had the company exit in January, and I'm pretty sure they didn't have rep and warranty insurance, but I didn't see any documentation about it. So.
You often see it, particularly in auctions, where companies have more than one bidder. It becomes one of the variables for sellers. So I'm going to move to the second trend, and this is some developments in a regulatory area called CFIUS. This used to be, I wouldn't call it esoteric, but it used to be an area you'd see very episodically where you have a foreign buyer come in and buy a company where there was concern, national security concern. It was pretty high level, and I wouldn't say that this was a frequent issue. I think the world changed last November, but before I get to that, let me just explain what this is. So CFIUS is an acronym for the Committee on Foreign Investments in the U.S. It's a loose interagency of basically Department of Defense, State, Treasury, and CIA and the other alphabet agencies. And it's triggered in two ways. One is a voluntary filing, and the other is a mandatory filing. And it basically, historically, has involved acquirers purchasing U.S. companies where there's been a national security concern. The voluntary filing is done because if there's concern about it, the parties will make a filing, disclosure, and go through a process with CFIUS. And the risk of not making such a filing is that there's no statute of limitations on a CFIUS review. They can break up a deal and have it unwound at any time if after the deal, the U.S. government determines that there was national security implications. So if there are, smart parties will make that voluntary filing, go through the process, and they are, in effect, they get a safe harbor. Now, what's changed is in November of last year, the administration created a pilot program for a mandatory, more short-form filing that's triggered by, and I'll put it in plain English, a foreign investor or party or buyer to a deal where there's critical technology. And that requires a mandatory filing, a waiting period, and then there's a question of whether the government will get involved or not. And it applies not only in M&A deals, but in finance deals, spin-outs, and joint ventures. And I saw this personally. I was mentioning to Dave, I've got 3 active CFIUS matters right now on deals. I had a conversation with the Treasury Department over a venture deal in the late fall. and they were holding up a deal from happening. I couldn't believe it. It was just surreal that this change affected a basic venture deal. That's how significant it is. It's affecting my clients that do spin-outs. I think there's a greater risk of it happening with certain countries. I would say China would be right up there, obviously China and Russia, but I've had other countries affected as well. But I think China has got the target on it right now for a variety of reasons. So that's caused, from a macro level, a pullback in both investing activity and M&A activity by Chinese or Chinese-affiliated companies.
Trevor, how involved is the White House in deciding when to exert that power?
Well, I think the pilot program, my guess was largely a product of pressure from the White House. But I don't know that the White House per se gets involved in, at least, unless it's a major deal. I've been dealing with the Treasury of all agencies, and I found them to be activist. This is a real issue, and it's going to affect you even in Series A financings, believe it or not. If you've got foreign investors or investors who have got their money from countries of concern. Go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple quick questions. The first was the review period of 45 to 90 days. There's no federal mandate that says they have to respond within the 45 to 90 days, is there?
I think for voluntary filings there might be. I know for mandatory filings there is a period in which they have to respond, and that's it's a pilot program. It's not been made permanent.
Yeah.
But I'm not a CFIUS attorney, so I at the end of the slide deck we've got the names of our attorneys. We've actually got a department that specializes in CFIUS matters, and they're going crazy right now.
And the second is there's a lot of foreign money that basically parks itself in the U.S. So the source is truly OUS capital, but it's parked in it's domiciled either in a friendly country or a U.S. entity. So is that subject to CFIUS-based regs as well?
I think it is, particularly if the CFIUS agencies sniff that out. I've got a deal where deal's done, but they sniffed it out, one of the investors, and are requiring now a voluntary filing. So again, I've doing this for 30 years. I've never seen that kind of dynamic.
So when I was VP of Biz Dev at St. Jude for one of the business units, we made equity investments from a European subsidiary into a U.S. entity, primarily because we didn't want to repatriate the cash and pay tax on it. And while that has changed because the repatriation tax is certainly lower, would that be subjected to a CFIUS type event as well?
Well, the company in question I'm dealing with it was formed in a European country, not one that you would consider like not Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe. So I don't know what drove Treasury to be interested, but taking that as a data point, I'd have to say it's possible.
Thanks.
And I'm just, any other issues here? One other point, this issue of critical technologies is largely still undefined for the pilot program, so there's more that's going to be known about that, but that uncertainty about what's critical or not is also an issue, and it's causing people to, on the margin, actually make decide that yes, we're covered by it. We're gonna make the mandatory filing and subject ourselves to this kind of torture by CFIUS. But it's a real thing, and so I'm bringing it up as a major trend and a change from prior years.
So I think that's something we definitely wanted to get on your radar. Not the greatest news in the corporate world and an industry that depends on M&A. It makes deals harder, longer, especially if there's a foreign investor involved. But you guys should be aware of that, especially where you do have a foreign acquisition or investment coming in. So another topic that we thought we wanted to make sure was on your radar that we're going to talk to now, I'm going to turn it over to Evan Holden. Talk about products liability, not necessarily litigation, but more importantly from all your perspective, risk mitigation. If you're at an early stage company now and you're developing a product, products liability used to be an afterthought. That was the acquirer's problem once they're in the market and selling more. But what we're seeing where we work with the big companies, even when we're doing diligence on deals now, we're bringing in the products liability team and Evan to look at products to see what is the risk. And if there is a bigger products liability risk based on the development of the product, the deal valuation or the deal terms can be affected where it's a bigger earnout as opposed to a bigger upfront. So I think products liability is creeping in much earlier than it had a decade ago and even 5 years ago. And if you're developing early stage technology, you really need to think about this now and get your documentation in place. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Evan.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of give you the lay of the land, there's lots of different litigation that device companies can face. There's the consumer class actions, there are securities, shareholder derivative actions, all kinds of government investigations. What I really deal with is the good old-fashioned personal injury product liability lawsuits, which are more and more frequently brought and kind of have higher and higher stakes. Like I mentioned before, there's been kind of a transformative change over the last 10 years where you have more and more of these mass tort consolidated actions in multi-district litigations with tens of thousands of cases consolidated. And just to give some quick basic background, so there's sort of two main types of products actions. You have your single plaintiff actions where there's a single individual plaintiff who's injured, oftentimes in a surgery where there's a complication. Perhaps the operative note indicates that a device may have malfunctioned. Plaintiffs will typically sue both the manufacturer as well as the physician, and possibly the hospital as well. And there tends to be some finger pointing between the device company and the surgeon. And the other kind of main type of product liability actions are these consolidated litigations, where there's one particular device from one particular manufacturer that's the target of this MDL with thousands, potentially tens of thousands of cases. And just to quickly illustrate this increase that I've been talking about, this is just a chart that shows the number of multi-district litigations in federal court involving medical devices. And you can see up until about 10 years ago, there was really only a small handful of medical device MDLs at any given time. But in the last 5 years or so, there's been more than 20 at any given time. And the number of actual individual lawsuits that are in those MDLs has increased even more exponentially. It used to be around 1,000 or so at any given time, and lately it's been in the closer to 100,000 cases. And then not only has the number of cases been increasing, but the actual exposure of each of those cases has been increased, as you've seen just bigger and bigger verdicts coming out from juries. Like I mentioned before, I think the plaintiff's bar is just increasingly well organized, well funded, and they've really been able to connect with juries. And these are just a few handful of some recent verdicts, but you see those HIP verdicts, talc verdicts that you see in the news all the time, routinely hundreds of millions of dollars. And frequently those verdicts that you hear about on the news are in what's called a bellwether trial, where there may be 5,000 cases in a particular manufacturer's MDL, and the parties will choose one particular plaintiff's case to try that's supposed to be representative of the rest of the cases. And that's known as a bellwether case. And so when the plaintiffs get a huge verdict in a bellwether, it sort of sets the bar for the settlement value of all those other cases. So it's bad news for the defendant. We can skip that. And this is a whole other topic of discussion, but just to briefly note, part of what's fueling this huge increase in both the exposure in those verdicts and also the number of cases, there's something called litigation funding that has just sort of crept onto the scene in the last 5 years or so. And these are hedge funds that are actually investing in advertising for personal injury lawsuits. and investing billions and billions of dollars into these advertisements, and then they will then own a stake in these individual plaintiffs' lawsuits, which to the lawyers in the room might sound kind of unethical, and it arguably is. But as a result, you have lots of more advertising on TV and the internet for claims, which then leads to these MDLs with like I said, just an exponentially increasing number of lawsuits, and that all then exerts a great deal of pressure on companies. Even if the device is a good device, if the warnings were good, if you're dealing with 10,000 cases, it's sort of, you're really going to try to settle that litigation, no matter how strong your defenses are, because it's just, the risk is huge. And like I've said, the number of claims is increasing, the verdicts are getting larger, but it's important to note that not only is there the risk in those actual verdicts and the settlements that you pay out, there's a lot of other harms to the company. The attorney's fees that you have to pay out, reputational harm, and also there's the time and resources that a company has to spend in defending litigation. The employees who have to be deposed and prepare for depositions, go to trial, that sucks a huge amount of time away from actual productive things that they could be doing. Just a quick note of sort of what drives litigation. Why do plaintiffs target a particular device? Usually it's publicly available information. Plaintiffs will review the FDA's list of any given safety communications, labeling changes, recalls, field actions. They can stay abreast of all that, and that's a great way to then target a particular device. They can do a little research and say, well, they made this labeling change, but if we look at the MAUD database, it looks like they could have made this change 5 years before. And we can just start advertising for claims like that, and plaintiffs are increasingly looking, if they have a device that fails in them or they think they have a claim, they'll do some investigation online and connect with attorneys that way. So it's not all bad news, for I think a lot of the folks in the room. You can sort of learn from some of the mistakes that have been made and try to get ahead of the game and find some ways to minimize your risk. One quick note is, I think I'm not sure if everyone realizes the decisions you make about the regulatory pathway that you go down at the start of a device's life make a huge impact on the risk you face. Specifically, if you go through the PMA pathway, pre-market approval, generally speaking, plaintiffs are barred from bringing claims that attack the design or the labeling of the device because the FDA has specifically approved that design and those labels as safe and effective. And so claims attacking them are preempted. However, if, of course, the vast majority of drugs go through the 510K pathway, and in those cases, plaintiffs are free to criticize the warnings, criticize the design of the device. And in fact, there's been a trend recently in some of these high-profile lawsuits where plaintiffs have successfully excluded any evidence of the FDA's role in 510K devices from trial, which can be very, very damaging to a company's defense. Just a quick note, one really important, a show of hands for folks who have devices on the market. How many of you have sales force that can interact either with physicians or patients? No one. Well,
It's an early stage audience.
early
I
stage.
guess.
In the event that you do, a real frequent way for plaintiffs to bring claims against device companies is based on the conduct of sales reps when they interact with physicians or with patients. And so it's really important to train those reps well so they know what to say, what to do. It's important to have good good policies, SOPs that sort of lay out what the role is of those sales reps, that they are there to provide technical support, not any clinical advice. And that can really help minimize the risk. And then one last point, and this is something that GT does a lot, is we help train companies in basically how to avoid putting things in emails that can be very damaging. And I think you'd be surprised how people don't really realize that anything you write as part of a risk analysis of a device or an adverse event investigation can and will often be shown to a jury. And frequently employees don't realize that and put some very damaging things in emails. And so it's really important to train employees and have clear policies about how you write things and to avoid putting damaging things in there.
The plaintiffs' lawyers have learned that what we all do, emails never actually die.
Never.
They're always there somewhere. And that email where someone goes, oh, wow, or a four-letter word, that's going to be on big screen right up here, and they're going to call that engineer to testify about what he meant when he said that. So
Yeah.
that's how you end up with a $100 million verdict. And that's-
Or a sales rep who's in an operating room and is texting back and forth with tech support about this terrible thing that's going on in surgery. Those text messages will be produced in the litigation. You can really drive up the value of the case.
So, great. So Omar, you're right now you're raising a seed series, Series A. How does products liability, does that impact your thesis? What are you thinking about that?
So we spent a lot of time on labeling and what exactly we want to get approval for. And our device is actually pretty straightforward. So in the world of cardiac ablation, the first FDA-approved device was introduced into the marketplace in 1993. So RF ablation has been around for a long time. Most of the mouse traps or devices that are being developed today are really optimizing a procedure that's long been established to be not only curative, but cost-effective for the patient, and therefore, that's not an area that keeps me up at night at all in our business today. But generally speaking, the comments around indication for use and the path of a PMA versus a 510K, those are things that, even in our company, we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about.
So something that does keep Omar up at night, I know, is IP, since I'm his IP attorney. So we glossed over IP, but maybe kind of in your closing here as we start to wrap things up, tell us what are you seeing from IP?
It's not the IP that keeps me up, it's the IP fees that keep me up.
I sleep nicely, I don't know. So.
No, I can't say enough good things about our IP counsel, and Dave and his team have just done an amazing job for us. So over the last 5 years, we've generated 15 issued patents. We've got over 30 in prosecution. And if there's one thing I can tell you, it's that Dave and his team and Greenberg Traurig know how to be an entrepreneur's friend when it comes to weathering tough times and accelerating when things are good. So IP is clearly a box that we feel very comfortably saying is well checked for us.
And Alex, how does IP impact on your investment thesis?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we certainly think about as we're investing. It's always the last thing we check. It's the last diligence box, because this is the box that costs the most money. Once you're doing diligence, you always make your term sheets contingent on the successful completion of IP diligence and freedom to operate. To my knowledge, I don't think we've ever not made an investment because of findings in IP. It does give us, typically the freedom to operate search and IP check will give us things to think about and suggestions to the company to how they might bolster their IP strategy. But at this point, we've not yet not made an investment due to IP.
Well, thank you guys for sticking with us. I know we're in overtime right now, so we're going to wrap up. I'm going to ask the panel a similar question. So we talked about trends they're seeing in the market. What do you think we're going to see over the next 6-12 months between when we meet today and when we meet next year? So we'll start with Evan and work our way down the panel.
Trying to think. I think
He still can't believe the guy lost on Jeopardy. That's,
you want to let me come back.
so we'll go to Omar and we'll come back.
So first, the Bruins are going to win.
Right.
Secondly, I think the M&A environment will continue to be fairly robust, but I think it's anybody's guess as to what's going to happen with the economy at a broader level. And, I take Trevor's words to heart that it's time to, really be prepared for bad times, but execute on every level and thrive if things go well.
Yeah, I'd say volatility would be my prediction because of the factors that affect it. And while the capital markets may suffer, I agree with you on M&A. Sometimes that can actually be an enhancement because prices dip, and there's still a lot of cash on the sidelines. And I think we're probably going to see a continued trend of M&A regardless of what happens.
Yeah, to Omar's point, the venture capital markets tend to be a lagging indicator of the overall economic cycle. So certainly are a lot of indicators pointing towards potential downturn. But I think 6 to 12 months from now, the venture market will be starting to think about potentially slowing down, but won't have slowed down.
And one, I talked a little bit about the attacks on the 510K process that have been made in litigation. This is a bit hopeful, but AdvaMed and the FDA are hopefully going to sort of clarify that the 510K process does address safety and efficacy, and that will sort of help make the argument easier in courtrooms that 510K evidence is still relevant evidence of safety and efficacy, and help get that into the case, which helps a great deal in cases involving 510K devices.
So you guys all get the gold stars for sticking through to the very end. Your prize, we buzzed through the slides on all the M&A and IPO exits, but if you want a copy, Trevor did a great job of compiling, and I'm sure he would be happy to share them with you. So that's your prize for sticking to the end. But let's have a hand for these great panelists.